No empire endures indefinitely. The Dutch, the British, and even the Romans eventually fell. Now, it appears we have another to add to that list. For nearly a century, the American empire has held total supremacy on the global stage. Despite representing only 4% of the world's population, it accounts for 20% of global income. This single nation alone constitutes almost 40% of the worldwide military budget. However, this situation is rapidly changing. By 2028, China is projected to surpass the U.S. as the largest economy in the world. For decades, China has been positioning itself at the heart of a new world order, biding its time for the right moment to strike. Since 2010, it has invested over $1 trillion in developing nations globally, forging strategic alliances for the future. Meanwhile, the American world order has never appeared more vulnerable. Government debt continues to accumulate, with interest repayments now consuming a sixth of the annual budget. Moreover, decades of globalization are being unraveled right before our eyes. The trust that America has cultivated over generations is gradually diminishing, eroded by tariffs, erratic policies, and a growing perception that the established rules no longer apply. It has been cautioned that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This issue transcends a single leader. It concerns what occurs when an empire begins to believe in its own invincibility long after its foundations have begun to weaken. The question extends beyond Trump. It revolves around whether America has reached a point of no return. The internal conflicts have already commenced. But can the American world order endure? Or are we witnessing the initial stages of a new global empire? The answer is more profound than most realize and traces back years before today. Just a few decades ago, the notion that the American empire could begin to falter in the near future would have been met with laughter. In the 1990s, the nation was reveling in the downfall of the Soviet Union. The dollar, already a dominant force, swiftly established itself as the unquestionable global currency. By 1995, it represented an astonishing 71% of worldwide foreign exchange reserves. The United States had officially emerged as the cornerstone of the global financial framework. Moreover, capitalism and democracy, the very pillars of American society, were rapidly proliferating around the world. Even traditional adversaries, nations historically opposed to capitalism like Russia, Poland, and Vietnam, began to shift their perspectives. The American empire had never appeared more robust. Yet, while the nation basked in its post-war triumph across the Pacific, a seemingly minor country was quietly setting the stage for its own economic revolution. If you are viewing this video, you are likely familiar with the narrative. By the 1990s, China had embarked on a path that would completely revolutionize its economy, altering the global landscape in the process. The Chinese economy would eventually expand by over 9% annually, lifting millions out of poverty along the way. However, rather than expressing concern, the elites in Washington at the time perceived this as a significant victory. Another communist nation had embraced change, recognizing the benefits of market economies. When China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2000, Bill Clinton viewed it not merely as a trade agreement, but as a pivotal moment in the nation's trajectory. By joining the WTO, China was not just committing to purchase more of our goods, it was also embracing one of democracy's most valued principles: economic freedom. The fact that China remained a one-party authoritarian regime was dismissed as a minor setback in an otherwise impeccable capitalist success story. After all, as the nation progressed, it would surely adopt democracy, wouldn't it? To the American perspective, China appeared to be the evidence that capitalism had triumphed, and the nation was embraced into the global order with enthusiasm. From 1995 to 2010, Chinese exports to the United States surged from approximately $100 billion to over $1.5 trillion. However, while Washington believed it had integrated China into its framework, they failed to recognize a deeper truth. Persistent effort can wear down even the hardest stone. China was not being altered. It was subtly and steadily reshaping its role on the global stage. Economies generally experience a transformation during their development phases. Initially, they focus on agricultural production, with the majority of the population engaged as subsistence farmers. Over time, there is a migration towards urban centers, and the workforce shifts to industrial and manufacturing sectors. This precisely occurred in China. Between 1990 and 2020, the manufacturing output of China skyrocketed from around $100 billion to nearly $5 trillion, marking an increase of more than 50 times. China had officially established itself as the world's manufacturing hub, and American consumers were more than willing to embrace this change. A staggering 97% of laptops and 78% of smartphones purchased in the United States are manufactured in China, and the country was producing far more than just technology. An impressive 80% of all sporting goods in the U.S. are sourced from China, along with about 83% of toys. Rather than being self-sufficient, America had unwittingly become entirely dependent on China. To clarify for the American consumer, on the surface, this situation seems beneficial. They enjoy access to a wider array of affordable products than ever before at lower prices. As inexpensive Chinese goods flooded the market, American consumers began to spend increasingly, filling their homes with budget-friendly items while inadvertently sinking deeper into financial difficulties. More Americans than ever are living paycheck to paycheck, depending on debt to sustain their lifestyles. This reliance on inexpensive debt isn't limited to U.S. consumers. By 2024, the U.S. government itself was burdened with $36 trillion in debt. Currently, 1 out of every $6 spent by the U.S. government is allocated to servicing this national debt, and there are no indications that this trend will reverse. Projections suggest that by 2034, the debt could soar to $54 trillion. This translates to an average debt of $150,000 for every American citizen. Due to decades of excessive spending, the nation is teetering on the brink of a crisis. However, this issue extends beyond mere finances. It exemplifies a classic symptom of a declining empire. Numerous empires have risen and fallen throughout history, all following a similar trajectory. Their downfall is not an abrupt occurrence, but rather a slow, decades-long decline, typically initiated by a surge in debt. Consider the Dutch Empire. In the 17th century, it was the preeminent financial power globally and appeared invincible. Yet, over time, the government increasingly overspent, living beyond its means without concern for future repercussions. By the late 18th century, the empire was already beginning to disintegrate. The indicators were unmistakable: an inflated government, escalating inequality, and an excessive dependence on foreign imports. Today, the U.S. is in a strikingly similar situation. Years of overspending and reliance on cheap imports have left the nation with a precarious foundation, poised for collapse. However, it's not only declining empires that exhibit these patterns. The emergence of empires has also followed a recognizable trajectory. It begins with a phase of rapid economic expansion, a manufacturing surge, increasing exports, and a significant rise in living standards. Following this, there is a growing international presence, marked by expanding influence through trade, diplomacy, and strategic investments. As time progresses, the emerging power gradually supplants the old order, transforming global politics to position themselves at the forefront. Today, China epitomizes this shift. For many years, the nation has been preparing to establish the New World Order. Their approach has been straightforward: invest now to dominate later. Unlike the United States or Europe, China does not rely on a consumption-driven economy. In America, 70% of GDP is allocated to consumption, while in the UK, it stands at 65%. In contrast, China only allocates 39%. Naturally, if individuals are not spending their money, they are saving it. These savings have created a substantial cash reserve, which the Chinese government and businesses can channel into long-term investments. High-speed rail, green energy farms, and semiconductor factories are all funded by the nation's savings. By the end of 2023, household savings had soared to a record $19.1 trillion, averaging about $57,000 per person. Since 2013, the country has invested over $1.3 trillion in developing countries, funding ports, railways, and power plants. This initiative now encompasses more than 150 countries, reaching into Europe and covering over 75% of the global population. They have also made significant investments in African development, a strategic decision given that by 2050, the continent is projected to represent over 25% of the world's population. In just the past decade, they have financed the construction of 12,000 kilometers of roads and established more than 20 ports and 80 power facilities. In comparison, the U.S. has demonstrated a far less impressive development record. Despite recent cuts, USAID, its equivalent organization, has only constructed 800 kilometers in the last 30 years, which is 15 times less than what China has achieved. In contrast to building infrastructure, the focus of U.S. international policy appears to be on engaging in endless foreign wars. Since the beginning of the century, the U.S. has been involved in more than 72 foreign conflicts. Take, for instance, the invasion of Iraq. It incurred an estimated cost of $2.2 trillion, yet after nearly 10 years of combat, there was little to show for it. For decades, the U.S. has acted as the global police force, attempting to spread democracy and capitalism worldwide, often through coercion. Conversely, China adopts a markedly different strategy. It does not aim to reshape foreign governments or impose its political ideology. Instead, its singular goal is to expand its own influence. Surprisingly, this does not lead to increased conflict. In fact, it often results in the opposite. Rather than seeking control, China prioritizes cooperation, forging partnerships with various nations, irrespective of their ideology, values, or governance. While the U.S. attempts to transform countries to fit its own model, China is content to collaborate with them as they are. We are now witnessing a confrontation between these two conflicting worldviews, and it appears that China is gaining the upper hand. In 2023, China's approval rating in Africa surpassed that of the U.S. for the first time ever, and gradually, the U.S.'s international presence is deteriorating, struggling to match the efficiency of the Chinese system. However, the shift in power is not only occurring abroad. For many years, a subtle economic trend has been quietly undermining the U.S. economy: deindustrialization. In the early 1960s, manufacturing jobs accounted for approximately 30% of all employment in America. By 2020, this figure had plummeted to just 8%. As global trade barriers began to diminish, American companies were no longer limited to domestic production. Instead, they began to explore overseas, pursuing lower costs and greater profit margins. Initially, this transition was gradual. Textile mills throughout the American South quietly closed as production shifted to more affordable labor markets in Asia. Steel towns such as Pittsburgh and Youngstown, which were once bustling with hundreds of factories, began to quietly shut down. However, once the dam broke, there was no turning back. What started as a few closures quickly escalated into a widespread exodus. The backbone of America's industry, the very force that fueled its post-war success, began to disappear. The sector that had historically provided stable, well-paying jobs for millions of Americans was decimated, leaving the U.S. heavily dependent on China. And the issues extend beyond that. The manufacturing industry had previously served as a great equalizer, offering fair wages, job security, and a pathway to upward mobility for everyday Americans. In its absence, many found themselves left behind in a swiftly evolving economy that favored capital, technology, and finance over manual labor and traditional skills. Now you may wonder, does any of this truly matter? After all, since the 1980s, the U.S. economy has more than doubled in size, showcasing the fastest growth rate among developed nations. Surely this economic expansion compensates for the decline in industry. But here lies the problem. Economic growth statistics fail to reflect who actually benefits from the additional wealth. It's nice to claim that the average person is wealthier on paper than they were 4 decades ago, but this doesn't necessarily mean that most individuals are experiencing an improvement in their lives. If the entirety of income growth is funneled to the wealthiest members of society, the quality of life for the majority remains stagnant, regardless of what economic growth figures indicate. And in America, this is precisely what has transpired. Since the 1970s, the proportion of income earned by those in the middle and lower classes has diminished, while the wealthiest have continued to amass a larger share of the nation's riches. Economic growth has disproportionately enriched the top tier of American society. Currently, the top 1% of the population controls over 30% of the nation's wealth, a significant increase from 22% in the 2000s. Yet, for those with lower incomes, this has had little impact. Since the year 2000, the average income for those in the lowest income bracket has essentially stayed the same at $28,000 annually. All the while, the proportion of individuals in this bottom bracket has surged from a quarter of the population to nearly 30%. While the nation reveled in impressive economic statistics, the reality for many has been strikingly different. As the wealthiest individuals capture an increasing share of income gains, the middle and lower classes have experienced total stagnation. The American dream, the belief that anyone can achieve success through hard work and determination, now appears to be a distant hope for many. To complicate matters, over the past 40 years, there has been a dramatic surge in housing prices. In the 1980s, the average home price was around $60,000. Today, those same homes would cost upwards of $400,000, reflecting an increase of over 500%, at a time when real incomes for the poorest have remained completely stagnant. Stagnant wages coupled with rising prices have left the American public disenchanted with the establishment. Across the nation, there is a growing sentiment that their institutions are failing them, and the call for change has become increasingly urgent. In 2024, they reached a breaking point. Trump secured a decisive victory on a promise to fulfill the American people's demands to restore America to its former glory. His plan essentially revolved around one key concept: tariffs. The concept was straightforward. By imposing a tax on imports, American companies would be compelled to reconsider their supply chains. To evade the tax, businesses would be incentivized to shift production back to the U.S., revitalizing the struggling manufacturing sector. As an added benefit, they were projected to generate $1.8 trillion over the next decade, funds the government desperately required given its substantial debt. In some respects, tariffs appeared to be a smart strategy. However, as you are aware, they have not precisely unfolded as intended. Just 10 days following the announcement, the Trump team had to reverse their stance, eliminating most of their tariffs. So, what went awry? The entire global economic framework established over the last century has relied on free trade and globalization, with the United States positioned at the core of this structure. When the U.S., the very creator of global free trade, abruptly changed direction and enacted extensive tariffs, it understandably unsettled investors. Suddenly, one sector posed a threat to their entire strategy: the bond market. If investors lost faith and began to sell treasury bonds in large quantities, interest rates would soar. And keep in mind, the government is in debt to the tune of $33 trillion. A mere 1% increase in interest rates costs them over $300 billion annually. A significant rise in interest rates could transform the government's unsustainable deficits into a full-blown fiscal crisis. However, this was not merely a failed policy. It represented a hasty, short-sighted action that has historically signaled the decline of empires. From Rome to Britain, powerful nations often resort to bold, reactive measures when their supremacy starts to wane, desperately trying to maintain control through tariffs, taxes, and isolation. America's abrupt withdrawal from the very global system it helped create was not a strategy. It was a warning signal. So, what does this mean for the American world order? For decades, they have dominated the global arena, their supremacy seemingly unassailable. Yet, now fissures are appearing, and escalating debt along with rising inequality have begun to undermine the pillars of American power. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China has been playing the long game. While America has borrowed to fuel consumption, China has saved to invest, developing the infrastructure and industries of the future. The contrast is striking, a nation weighed down by debt and short-term thinking versus one that prioritizes long-term growth and stability. As the United States confronts its financial difficulties, the global community observes, questioning if the age of American supremacy is coming to an end. Moreover, it appears more and more probable that the Chinese century is not merely a possibility, but rather an inevitability.